The air over the Rhineland was heavy with the smell of smoke and soil. A thin mist clung to the morning fields, veiling the scars left by war and drought. Somewhere in that gray distance, the faint rumble of tanks could be heard, not near enough to bring death yet, but close enough to make the crows scatter from the wheat fields in fear. Hans Bauer leaned against his old plow, its blade worn down by years of cutting through hard earth. The Reich demanded food for its soldiers, and every German farmer was now a cog in that vast machine. But Hans was no ordinary cog. Beneath his weathered hands and quiet demeanor, he harbored a secret that could cost him his life. He watched the road that cut across his farm, the same road that had once led to the village market. Now it was used by soldiers, their trucks loaded with supplies and prisoners. The once bustling road had become a silent witness to the cruelty of the Reich. Hans spat on the ground, wiped his brow, and glanced toward the old barn. Hidden beneath its rotting boards, he kept something that made his heart beat faster every time he thought about it: weapons, smuggled from dead soldiers, hidden beneath sacks of grain. Pistols, grenades, and a single radio transmitter. He hadn't planned for any of this. He was a farmer, not a fighter. But war had a way of choosing its soldiers. It began 2 winters ago, when the Wehrmacht came to his village. They took everything: livestock, wheat, even the church bells. They said it was all for the fatherland. Hans's wife, Marta, had pleaded for them to leave enough grain for their children. The officer in charge, a young man with sharp cheekbones and dead eyes, had sneered and struck her across the face. Marta died that winter, not from the blow, but from hunger. Their youngest, Lena, followed a month later. Only Hans and his son Karl remained. From that moment, the soil that had once given Hans life began to whisper vengeance. Now, every night after dark, he and Karl would light a single lantern in the barn. They would dig through the hay and dust to uncover their secret stash. Karl, barely 17, had grown harder since the occupation. "Father," he'd said one night, loading a pistol with trembling hands, "how many men have to starve before someone fights back?" Hans didn't answer. He just looked at his son, the boy who once chased butterflies through these same fields, and realized there was no turning back. Their first act was small. Hans sabotaged a shipment meant for a nearby garrison. The soldiers had ordered him to load their trucks with crates of wheat. Hans filled the bottom half with sand and stones, covering it with just enough grain to fool them. The trucks left at dawn, and by the time they reached their destination, the deceit was discovered. Hans waited for the Gestapo to come for him, but they never did. The soldiers blamed the peasants who loaded the carts. The taste of success was bitter, but it lit something in him. Soon after, Hans met others who shared his hatred. A blacksmith named Otto, a priest who had been stripped of his title, and a widow named Greta whose husband had been executed for desertion. Together they formed a small network, a resistance hidden among the farms. They called themselves the Plowmen, a name meant to remind them of what they truly were: people of the soil. At night, Hans would transmit coded messages through his battered radio, hidden beneath the barn floor. The radio had come from a downed British pilot who'd crashed nearby months before. Hans had dragged the injured man into his barn and tended to his wounds in secret. The pilot's name was Thomas Hale. Blond, lean, with eyes that burned with quiet resolve. He couldn't speak German well, but gratitude needed no translation. When he healed enough to move, Hans gave him his son's old coat and smuggled him toward the Swiss border. In return, Hale taught Hans how to operate the radio, how to tap messages that reached far beyond their dying village. The radio became Hans's weapon. Every word he sent was a strike against the Reich. He'd send locations of German supply routes, train schedules, troop movements. Sometimes, when he couldn't bear the weight of silence, he'd simply tap out a few words of defiance: "We still sow. We still live." But secrets never stay buried long. One evening in the spring of 1944, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Hans noticed movement near the old well. 3 men in long black coats. Gestapo. Their boots sank into the mud as they approached his house. Karl saw them too and froze mid-step. "Go to the barn," Hans whispered. "Hide the radio." Karl ran while Hans met the officers at the door, wiping his hands on his trousers to hide his shaking. "Farmer Bauer," the lead officer said, his voice cold and rehearsed. We've received reports that someone in this area has been transmitting unauthorized radio signals. Perhaps you've seen something." Hans shook his head. "Only crows, Herr Officer. They make more noise than any man around here." The officer's thin lips curled into something between a smile and a threat. "Then you won't mind if we look around." Hans's heart hammered in his chest. As the soldiers spread out through the house, he prayed silently. In the barn, Carl worked frantically, burying the radio beneath sacks of grain. The sound of boots drew closer. Then a shout, "Sir!" Footprints. Fresh ones. Hans's blood ran cold. The officer turned sharply, motioning toward the barn. "Let's have a look, shall we?" They found Carl inside, his hands covered in dust, his face pale. "What are you hiding, boy?" the officer demanded. "Just grain," Carl stammered. The officer shoved him aside and plunged his hand into the pile. When his fingers brushed the cold metal of the radio, Hans felt his world collapse. They dragged Carl out by the collar. "This is treason," the officer hissed. "The punishment is death." Hans fell to his knees. "He's just a boy. It was me. I forced him." The officer studied Hans for a moment. "We'll see what your story's worth." That night, they took Carl away. Hans watched from the window as his son disappeared down the road, the truck's red taillights glowing like eyes of the devil. For the first time since Marta's death, Hans wept. Days turned into weeks. The fields grew wild without his care, and the villagers avoided his farm. He spent his nights sitting by the barn, staring at the dirt where the radio once lay. Then one evening, Greta came to him, her face pale beneath the moonlight. "Hans," she whispered, "Carl is alive. They've taken him to the labor camp near Bremen. Otto's cousin works there. He says there's a chance to get him out." Hans's eyes filled with a fire Greta hadn't seen in months. "When?" "Tomorrow night. But we'll need weapons." He went to the barn and unearthed the hidden pistols. The same ones he'd vowed never to use. He loaded them carefully, each click echoing like a prayer. The next night, the three of them, Hans, Greta, and Otto, rode out under the cover of fog. The labor camp loomed like a shadow on the horizon, its fences topped with wire that glistened like fangs. They moved swiftly, silently. Greta carried the bolt cutters, Otto carried the dynamite. Hans carried his pistol. A single guard stood near the rear fence, smoking. Hans crept behind him, his boots sinking into the mud. He raised the pistol and hesitated. He had spent his whole life taking life from the earth, weeds, pests, animals, but never from a man. Then he saw Carl's face in his mind, pale and afraid. The shot echoed through the fog. The guard fell. They cut the fence, slipped through, and found Carl in one of the outer barracks. He was thinner, older somehow, but his eyes still held that same stubborn spark. "Father," Carl whispered. Hans embraced him. "We're going home." But home was no longer waiting for them. By the time they reached the farm, flames were licking at the barn roof. The Gestapo had been there first. Otto was hit in the shoulder trying to help. Greta stayed behind to drag him away. Hans and Carl ran toward the forest. The night air burned with smoke. Behind them, the barn exploded, scattering years of harvest and hope into the wind. They didn't stop running until dawn. When they finally collapsed beneath a grove of pines, Carl turned to his father. "What now?" Hans looked toward the east, where the first light touched the horizon. "We plant again," he said softly. "Not wheat this time. Freedom." Over the next months, they joined a larger resistance cell operating in the Black Forest. Hans became a symbol among them, the farmer who had turned his plow into a weapon, his grief into courage. He taught others how to hide radios in haystacks, how to code messages in seed shipments, how to use the language of the land to confuse patrols. Every time he held the pistol, he remembered the weight of the plow in his hands. The two had become the same, tools of labor and liberation. When the war finally ended in 1945, Hans stood in the ruins of what had once been his farm. The barn was gone, the fields burned, but beneath the ashes, new shoots of green were already pushing through. Carl stood beside him, older now, his eyes steady. "Do you think it was worth it?" he asked. Hans smiled faintly. "Every seed takes time to grow," he said. "Some need fire before they can sprout." He knelt and pressed his hand into the soil, the same soil that had buried his past and fed his rebellion. For the first time in years, it felt alive again. As the wind swept across the fields, Hans could almost hear Marta's voice in the whispering wheat. "You kept your promise," she seemed to say. "You fought, not with hate, but with the strength of the earth." Hans rose to his feet, the sun warm on his back, and began to walk toward the horizon with Karl beside him. The plow and the pistol lay buried behind them, two halves of the same story, one that would be told by the survivors, the soil, and the silence that finally, mercifully, ended. And though the Reich had tried to break him, Hans Bauer, the farmer of the Rhineland, had already sown something far stronger than fear. Freedom had taken root.